Charlene Whitlow had called the family meeting for a Sunday afternoon in her Memphis home, and she had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with a list, and the list was titled in her own neat handwriting at the top of a legal pad, Options Going Forward, and Corinne sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the living room, slightly apart from the couch, where Xavier sat between his mother and his father. And Charlene began by saying that she loved Corinne, that this was not personal, that she only wanted what was best for her son. And then she read from the list. She said Xavier was 39 years old and had spent 5 years now managing a household on a single income, while caring for a wife who could not work the way she used to. She said the mortgage was a strain. She said Xavier had turned down a regional promotion that would have required relocation because Corinne's doctors were here in Memphis. She said sacrifice was a beautiful thing, but sacrifice needed a ceiling. And then Charlene said the sentence she had clearly been building toward for the entire speech. She said, Xavier, I think it is time we talked seriously about what kind of care Corinne actually needs, and who is equipped to provide it, because you cannot keep carrying this alone. And Corinne, who had said nothing for the entire 11 minutes of the speech, looked at her mother-in-law with the specific stillness of a woman who has heard every version of this conversation before it happened, because she had rehearsed hearing it in her mind more than once over the past 5 years. And she said, Charlene, I need you to say the rest of it, the part you have not said yet. And Charlene, caught slightly off balance by the directness, said, What part? And Corinne said, The part where you tell my husband he should leave me, because I am a financial burden he cannot carry. Say that part. And the room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when someone has just named the thing everyone else was dancing around. And Charlene said, Corinne, that is not what I said. And Corinne said, It is exactly what you said. You just said it in 5 sentences instead of 1. And stay with me, because what Charlene Whitlow did not know, what Xavier himself did not fully know, what nobody in that Memphis living room understood, was that the woman they were discussing as a dependent who could not work, could not contribute, could not carry her share, had spent the last 4 years quietly building a financial position that made every single person in that room, combined, look modest by comparison. And what happens over the following 8 weeks after that Sunday afternoon is not a story about a woman proving her worth, because Corinne Whitlow had never once doubted her own worth. It is a story about what happens when the people around you build an entire plan for your future on an assumption they never once thought to verify. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now if you have not already, because we tell the stories on this channel that nobody else is telling, and this community is growing every single day. Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us. If your in-laws called a family meeting to discuss whether you were too much of a financial burden for your spouse to carry, what would your first words be? We read every single comment, and we want to hear from you before this story is over. Corinne Whitlow was born Corinne Ashby in Memphis, Tennessee in 1985, and she grew up the kind of sharp, quietly relentless child that teachers describe in parent conferences as gifted, but does not always show it. She was the kind of student who sat near the back of the classroom and rarely raised her hand, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had already worked out 3 additional questions the lesson had not yet reached. Her mother Yolanda worked double shifts as a licensed practical nurse for most of Corinne's childhood, and Corinne learned early to be self-sufficient in the specific way children of hard-working single parents often become self-sufficient. Doing her own homework without supervision, managing her own schedule, understanding by the time she was 10 years old that nobody was going to hand her anything she had not earned herself. She graduated near the top of her class at a Memphis magnet high school and went on to study accounting at the University of Memphis, working 2 part-time jobs throughout her college years the way her mother had worked double shifts. And by the time she was 28, she had built a solid career as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized logistics company headquartered downtown. She was good at the work in the specific way that people are good at work that fits exactly how their mind operates. She saw patterns in numbers the way some people see patterns in music. She could look at a spreadsheet of shipping costs across 40 regional distribution centers and identify within an afternoon which 3 were quietly bleeding the company money in ways nobody else had noticed. And she had been on a clear trajectory toward a director-level position when she met Xavier Whitlow at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer of 2016. Xavier was a warm, easygoing man who worked as a regional operations manager for a beverage distribution company. He was not the sharpest person in most rooms he occupied, and he knew it. And one of the things he loved most about Corinne from the beginning was that he had told her early in their relationship, the smartest person he had ever gotten to keep. He said this with genuine admiration rather than insecurity, and in those early years it seemed to Corinne like exactly the right foundation for a partnership, a man who was not threatened by her mind and who was, in his own steady, unremarkable way, deeply kind. They married in 2018 in a small ceremony at a church in the Whitehaven neighborhood, where Corinne had grown up. Yolanda cried through the entire service, and for the first 2 years of their marriage, their life together looked exactly like the life two ambitious, hardworking people build when nothing has yet happened to interrupt it. Corinne kept climbing at her firm, Xavier kept climbing at his, and they bought a modest brick house in a quiet Memphis neighborhood with the specific pride of two people who had built something themselves. They talked, in those years, about children eventually, about a bigger house eventually, about all the ordinary future plans that young married couples make without any real sense of how quickly a single evening can rearrange all of it. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in March of 2020. Corinne was driving home from a late meeting downtown, tired, thinking about a client presentation due the following morning, when a driver ran a red light at the intersection of Poplar and a side street, and struck her car on the driver's side with enough force to spin the vehicle nearly a full rotation before it came to rest against a light pole. The impact fractured her spine at the T10 vertebra, and Corinne has told me that she remembers almost nothing of the accident itself, only the strange clarity of lying in the wreckage, understanding, before any paramedic arrived, before any doctor confirmed it, that something fundamental about her body had just changed permanently. After 4 surgeries and 7 months of hospitalization and rehabilitation, Corinne came home from the hospital using a wheelchair, a permanent and complete change to how she moved through the world, and the first year after the accident was, by Corinne's own account, the hardest year of her life, not simply because of the physical adjustment, which was significant and exhausting in ways that people who have not lived it rarely understand, relearning how to transfer from bed to chair, relearning how to navigate a world built almost entirely without her in mind, but because of the specific grief of losing a career trajectory she had spent a decade building. Her firm was, on paper, accommodating. They installed a ramp, they widened a doorway, they said all the correct things in the meeting where she returned to work 8 months after the accident. But the reality of an open-plan office not truly designed for a wheelchair, the reality of colleagues who had once seen her as the sharpest person in the room, now speaking to her more slowly and more simply than they used to, leaning down to talk to her the way adults lean down to talk to children. The reality of being quietly moved off of the accounts that required travel and client-facing energy, and onto internal reporting work that kept her largely out of rooms where decisions were made it clear to Corinne within 8 months that the career she had built was not going to survive the accident intact. Not because her mind had changed in any way. Her mind was, if anything, sharper than it had ever been, sharpened by 7 months of having nothing to do in a hospital bed except think. But because the people around her had started treating her mind as though it had changed along with her legs. And there is a specific and quiet exhaustion, Corinne has told me, in being brilliant in a room full of people who have already decided you are not. Corinne left her position at the logistics firm in early 2021, and this departure, more than anything else that happened afterward, is the piece of the story that Charlene Whitlow built her entire understanding of her daughter-in-law around. Charlene saw a woman who used to have a career and no longer did, and Charlene, who loved her son and who had strong and frequently stated opinions about what a marriage required to function, filed this fact away as the central and defining truth of who Corinne now was, and never once updated that understanding in the 4 years that followed. What Charlene did not see, because Corinne did not show it to her, was what Corinne was doing during the 18 months that followed her departure from the firm, working from her home office, teaching herself the specific skills of independent financial consulting through online coursework and certification programs completed late at night after Xavier had gone to bed, building relationships one at a time with small and mid-sized business owners across Memphis and the surrounding region who needed sophisticated financial oversight, but could not afford or did not need a full-time chief financial officer. Her first client came through a former colleague who had left the logistics firm to start his own trucking company, and remembered exactly how sharp Corinne's financial instincts had always been. And word moved from there the way it always moves in small business communities, quietly, through trust, one recommendation at a time. Corinne built, from her home office, over the course of those 18 months, a fractional CFO practice that by the end of 2022 was serving 11 client businesses on retainer, providing the kind of financial strategy and oversight that businesses making 7 and 8 figures in annual revenue depend on completely, restructuring debt, catching cash flow problems months before they would have become crises, building the kind of financial systems that let a business owner sleep at night. And she did this work in the specific way she had always worked, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing each new client to anyone outside her own home, because the work itself was the point, and because she had learned something important during her recovery, which was that her own understanding of her worth did not require anyone else's confirmation of it. There was a second financial reality that Charlene also did not know about, which was the settlement. The driver who had run the red light was found fully at fault, uninsured motorist coverage, and the other driver's own policy combined. And after 14 months of litigation, Corinne's attorney secured a settlement that was, by any reasonable measure, substantial, enough to fully cover her medical expenses many times over and enough, if managed carefully, to become the foundation of real long-term financial security. Corinne made a decision in the weeks after the settlement was finalized that she has told me was one of the clearest decisions of her adult life. She decided that the settlement money was not going to become lifestyle spending. It was not going to buy a bigger house or a newer car or any of the things that would have made her family's assumptions about her financial situation feel, temporarily, less true. It was going to become capital, quiet and growing and entirely separate from anyone else's perception of her. She met with a financial advisor recommended to her by her rehabilitation physician, a woman named Priscilla Odom, who specialized in working with clients managing significant settlement funds, and who understood the specific psychology of clients who had survived something traumatic and needed a financial plan built around long-term security rather than short-term comfort. And together they built a diversified investment portfolio, conservative in its early structure and increasingly sophisticated as Corinne's own financial expertise, sharpened by her new consulting work, allowed her to take a more active role in directing it herself. Priscilla Odom, the financial advisor, remembers their first meeting clearly enough that she brought it up again years later when Corinne referred a client to her. She has said that most people who come to her office after a settlement arrive either paralyzed by the money, afraid to touch it, or eager to spend it as quickly as possible as a way of proving to themselves that something good had finally happened after something terrible. Corinne arrived with neither reaction. She arrived with a legal pad of her own, questions already written out in advance, wanting to understand tax implications and diversification strategy and long-term compounding in the same specific language she used with her own clients. Priscilla told her early on that most of her clients wanted to be told what to do, and Corinne had said, "I do not want to be told what to do. I want to understand it well enough that nobody can ever tell me what to do with it either." And over the following 4 years that relationship became less advisor and client and more two financial professionals reviewing a portfolio together. Priscilla has said that watching Corinne's own expertise catch up to and eventually exceed her own in certain specific areas was one of the more satisfying professional experiences of her career. Corinne's consulting practice grew the way trust-based businesses grow in a city like Memphis, slowly and then suddenly. Her third client was a woman named Renata Cole who owned a chain of 3 hair and beauty supply stores, and who had been quietly losing money for 2 years without understanding why, until Corinne spent a single afternoon with her books and identified a wholesale supplier who had been overbilling her by a percentage small enough to go unnoticed on any individual invoice, but large enough, across 2 years and 3 locations, to have cost Renata nearly $40,000. Renata told everyone she knew about the woman in the wheelchair who had found her $40,000 in an afternoon. And 2 more clients came from that single conversation. By the time Corinne's practice reached its 4th year, she was not chasing clients anymore. She was declining them, choosing carefully who she had the bandwidth to serve well rather than growing simply for the sake of growing. And by the time of the family meeting in Charlene's living room, 5 years after the accident, that portfolio, combined with the consistent and growing income from Corinne's consulting practice, had made Corinne Whitlow, in strictly financial terms, considerably more wealthy, and considerably more financially secure than her husband, her mother-in-law, or anyone else in that room. Xavier knew, in general terms, that Corinne worked from home and that she had some clients. He saw her at her desk most days, laptop open, phone occasionally to her ear in the careful measured tone she used with clients. He saw invoices go out and payments come in. But Xavier had never been a details person about money. Even before the accident, it had been Corinne who managed their household finances, who paid the bills, who tracked the budget, and after the accident this pattern simply continued along the same lines it always had. Corinne kept her consulting income and her investment portfolio in accounts that were entirely her own, not out of secrecy in any dramatic sense, but because that was how she had always managed her own earnings even before they married. And because, as the months and then years went by and Charlene's comments about Corinne being a burden Xavier carried became more frequent and more pointed, Corinne made a specific and deliberate decision not to correct the record. She has told me that in the early years after the accident, she genuinely did not have the emotional capacity to fight a narrative on top of rebuilding her entire relationship with her own body, that surviving each day was already the full extent of what she had available, and that by the time she did have that capacity, somewhere around the third year, she found that she did not particularly want to spend it convincing her mother-in-law of anything. She said, Charlene was going to believe what she wanted to believe about me regardless of what I told her. So I stopped trying to manage her beliefs and started managing my life. Xavier absorbed his mother's framing of Corinne slowly and without ever fully agreeing with it out loud. He loved his wife, and he did not think of her as a burden in the moments when he was actually paying attention to their actual life together, watching her handle a difficult client call with total composure, watching her outmaneuver a contractor who tried to overcharge them for a home repair. But Charlene called or visited nearly every week, and every week carried some version of the same message, delivered with genuine love and genuine worry, but delivered nonetheless, that Xavier was sacrificing too much, that a 39-year-old man should not be turning down promotions, that a marriage required two people pulling in the same direction, and Charlene was not sure that Corinne, through no fault of her own, was still able to pull. There was a specific Thanksgiving, the third one after the accident, when Charlene had said, in front of the entire extended family while carving the turkey, that she did not know how Xavier did it, carrying so much alone, and Corinne had sat at that table and said nothing, because saying something would have required explaining a financial picture she had decided was not Charlene's to know. There was another moment, roughly a year before the family meeting, when Charlene arrived at their house unannounced on a Saturday morning with an envelope containing $300 in cash, and told Corinne, in the specific, gentle tone people use when they believe they are being generous, that she wanted Corinne to have a little something of her own, something that was not tied to what Xavier was managing, and Corinne had taken the envelope and thanked her mother-in-law and set it in a kitchen drawer where it sat untouched for months, because saying anything true in that moment, that the $300 represented roughly 4 hours of her own consulting income, would have required a conversation Corinne was not yet ready to have. And by the 5th year after the accident, Xavier had arrived at a place where his mother's characterization of his marriage had become the lens through which he interpreted his own daily life, even when the daily life in front of him did not actually match the characterization. This is the specific and quiet mechanism by which the most damaging family narratives take hold. Not through a single dramatic conversation, but through years of small, consistent repetition that eventually starts to feel like independently arrived at truth rather than something that was told to you. Subscribe to Psyche Tales TV right now, because this story is about to show you exactly what Corinne had been building while everyone around her believed she had nothing left to build with. And you need to be here for what happens next. Tell us in the comments. Has anyone in your life ever assumed you had less to offer because of something you were going through? Drop your answer below, because we want to hear from you before this story is over. Corinne began the specific work of protecting herself formally about 2 years before the family meeting in Charlene's living room. The decision was prompted by a particular conversation, one that Corinne has described to me in detail, because it was the moment she understood exactly what direction things were eventually going to move in. Xavier came home from a Sunday dinner at his parents' house and told Corinne, in what he clearly believed was a gentle and loving way, sitting on the edge of their bed still in his church clothes, that his mother had raised an idea worth thinking about, which was whether it might make sense for Xavier to be added more formally to the management of their household finances, given, as Charlene had put it, everything Corinne was dealing with. Xavier framed it as a practical suggestion, nothing urgent, just something to think about. He did not seem to understand, as he said it, the full weight of what he was actually relaying, and Corinne listened to her husband relay this suggestion and felt something settle into focus that had been unfocused before. She understood in that moment that the assumption underneath Charlene's years of comments was not simply that Corinne could not work. It was that Corinne, because of her disability, might eventually be considered someone whose financial judgment could reasonably be questioned or overridden. That this was the direction the years of comments had always been quietly moving toward, and Corinne, who had spent her entire professional life inside the world of financial structures and legal protections, understood exactly what that kind of thinking could eventually become if it was left unaddressed. She did not say any of this to Xavier that night. She simply said she would think about it, and she began thinking about it the following morning in the specific methodical way she thought about everything. She called an attorney the following week, a Memphis estate and business attorney named Denise Marsh, who had been recommended to her by one of her consulting clients, and Corinne sat across from Denise in her home office, laptop open with her full financial picture displayed, and laid it all out, the settlement-derived investment portfolio, the consulting practice and its structure, the household accounts, and she said, "Denise, I need every piece of what is mine to be documented in a way that cannot be questioned, reinterpreted, or quietly absorbed into a joint decision I was not fully part of." Denise reviewed everything over the following weeks. She confirmed that the investment portfolio was held entirely in Corinne's individual name. She formalized Corinne's consulting practice as a properly structured limited liability company with Corinne as the sole member, protecting both the business and its growing revenue as separate and clearly hers. She drafted a comprehensive durable power of attorney naming Corinne's own mother, Yolanda Ashby, rather than Xavier, as the person authorized to make financial decisions on Corinne's behalf in the event Corinne were ever unable to make them herself. A document, Denise explained, was specifically important given the pattern Corinne had described, because without it, a hospital or a court, in an emergency, might default toward the spouse regardless of what the spouse's own family had been quietly angling toward, and Denise asked Corinne directly, more than once, whether she understood that these structures meant her financial life would remain entirely her own regardless of any future family decision about her capacity. And Corinne said she understood completely, and she said something to Denise in that first meeting that Denise would remember clearly enough to repeat back to Corinne 2 years later. She said, "I am not protecting this money from my husband. I am protecting it from the version of my life other people keep trying to write for me." Corinne's mother Yolanda was the one person outside of Denise's office who understood the full picture from the beginning. Yolanda had raised Corinne as a single mother in Whitehaven, working double shifts as a licensed practical nurse, and she had watched her daughter rebuild an entire life and an entire career from a hospital bed with the specific ferocious quiet competence that Yolanda recognized, because she had spent her own life demonstrating the same thing. Yolanda came to Corinne's house most Thursday afternoons, bringing groceries neither of them particularly needed as an excuse to sit together for a few hours. And on one particular Thursday, roughly a year before the family meeting, sitting at Corinne's kitchen table while Corinne reviewed a client's quarterly financials on her laptop, Yolanda asked her daughter directly why she did not simply tell Charlene the truth, why she let her mother-in-law keep believing that Xavier was carrying the household alone. And Corinne set down her laptop and said, "Mama, if I tell Charlene the truth, she does not become a different person. She becomes a person who is angry that I did not tell her sooner. And then she spends the rest of her life trying to find a way to make my success about something other than my own work. Maybe she decides I was hiding it out of spite. Maybe she decides Xavier should have access to it since he was the one struggling under her assumption. I would rather she underestimate me quietly than resent me loudly." Yolanda did not fully agree with this reasoning. She thought her daughter carried an unnecessary weight in service of a peace that was not being extended back to her in return, and she said so plainly. She had her own history with Charlene. The two women had known each other since before Corinne and Xavier married. Pleasant enough at family gatherings, but never close, and Yolanda had noticed, long before the accident, A certain quality in how Charlene spoke about people's circumstances. A tendency to arrive at conclusions quickly and hold them permanently. Yolanda had said to Corinne more than once over the years that Charlene was the kind of woman who decided who you were within the first year of knowing you, and then spent the rest of the relationship interpreting everything you did through that original decision. But she also understood, the way only a mother who had raised a daughter to be this specific kind of self-sufficient could understand, that Corinne was going to move on her own timeline. And that timeline, Yolanda suspected long before the family meeting happened, was heading somewhere. The family meeting itself, the one that opened this story, was called by Charlene roughly 8 months after the conversation about adding Xavier more formally to the household finances. Charlene had spent those 8 months watching what she interpreted as a worsening situation. Xavier still had not been added to anything. Corinne still, in Charlene's understanding, contributed nothing visible to the household's finances. And the mortgage strain Charlene believed was crushing her son had, in her mind, only continued. And Charlene, out of what she would later insist and largely believe was genuine love for her son, decided the time had come to say plainly what she had been implying for years. She spent the week before the meeting drafting her list, refining the language, believing she was doing something difficult but necessary. And when Corinne, in that living room, forced Charlene to say the actual sentence rather than the 5 sentences that danced around it, the room experienced the same 3-stage reckoning that tends to follow when an assumption several years in the making meets a reality nobody bothered to verify. The first stage was defensiveness. Charlene insisted that she had never said Xavier should leave, that she had only raised a question about care and capacity, and Corinne, calmly, and without raising her voice, said, "Charlene, let us be precise. You asked whether I am too much for my husband to carry. That is a question about whether I am worth staying married to. Do not soften it now that I have said it back to you plainly." Xavier, sitting between his mother and his father, said nothing for a long moment, his eyes moving between the two women. And then he said, quietly, "Mama, I think you need to hear what you actually said." And Charlene, hearing her own son say this, went quiet in a way she had not been quiet during the entire 11-minute speech. The second stage was an attempt to redirect toward practicality. Charlene's father, Ellis Whitlow, who had said almost nothing during the entire meeting, sitting with his hands folded in his lap the way he sat through most family gatherings, spoke up at this point and said that regardless of how anything had been phrased, the household did have real financial pressures, and that pretending otherwise did not solve anything. And this, more than anything Charlene had said, was the opening Corinne had been waiting for without ever having planned to wait for it. She reached into the bag hanging from the side of her wheelchair and pulled out a folder, prepared, though nobody in the room yet understood this, weeks earlier, at Denise Marsh's suggestion, specifically for a moment like this one, and she opened it, and set the top page on the coffee table, and said, "Ellis, I would like you to look at something." The third stage, the one that took the longest for the room to fully absorb, unfolded over the following several minutes as Corinne walked her in-laws through exactly what the folder contained, a summary, prepared by Denise, of Corinne's investment portfolio's current value, a summary of her consulting practice's annual revenue over each of the past 3 years, and a copy of the durable power of attorney naming her own mother rather than her husband, documents that collectively made clear that Corinne Whitlow was not a woman who had contributed nothing to her household. She was a woman who had, for years, contributed considerably more than anyone else in the room, and had done so while deliberately allowing her mother-in-law to believe otherwise, because the alternative, being seen and then resented for it, had seemed to her like a worse outcome than being underestimated in silence. Charlene looked at the documents for a long time without speaking, turning each page slowly, and when she finally spoke, what she said was not what anyone expected. She said, "Why would you let me believe you were the reason my son was struggling?" And Corinne said, "Because you had already decided that before I lost the use of my legs." Charlene, this was never really about money, and Charlene did not have an answer to that. Xavier's own reckoning happened more slowly and more privately over the weeks that followed. The first 2 weeks after the family meeting were, by Corinne's account, mostly silence, not hostile silence, but the specific quiet of a household where everyone was still individually absorbing what had happened. Xavier went to work each day, and came home, and the two of them existed in the same house with a careful, unfamiliar politeness neither of them had needed with each other in years. Charlene called twice during those first 2 weeks, and Corinne did not answer, not out of anger exactly, but because she genuinely did not yet know what she would say. He sat with the specific and uncomfortable understanding that he had spent years absorbing his mother's characterization of his own marriage without ever once sitting down with his wife's actual financial records, that he had allowed a narrative to shape how he treated Corinne, in small ways, subtle ways, the way he sometimes spoke to her, more slowly than he needed to, the way he had, without ever fully deciding to, started thinking of himself as the one who was sacrificing rather than one half of a partnership. He found himself replaying specific moments, the promotion he had turned down and privately resented turning down, without ever telling Corinne he resented it, the Thanksgiving comment he had not corrected, the envelope of cash his mother had handed his wife like an allowance. He called his older brother Marcus one evening during this period, the only person he felt he could say the full truth to, and told him everything, and Marcus, after listening for a long time, said, "So Mama has been feeling sorry for you for 5 years over a situation that was never actually true." And Xavier said, "Worse than that. I let her," and he came to Corinne on a Wednesday evening roughly 3 weeks after the family meeting, finding her in her home office, and said, "I let my mother tell me who you were instead of paying attention to who you actually are, and I do not know how to undo 5 years of that." And Corinne, who had been waiting a long time to hear her husband say something honest about his own part in it rather than only about his mother's, told him the truth, which was that she did not know either. That trust, once it has been quietly eroded by years of small absorbed doubts, does not repair itself the moment the doubts are proven wrong, that she needed him to actually change how he showed up, not simply apologize for how he had shown up before. The remaining 5 weeks of that 8-week period were not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything resolved. There were instead a series of small, deliberate choices. Xavier asking Corinne actual questions about her consulting work for the first time in years and listening to the answers. Corinne slowly allowing herself to believe that the asking was genuine rather than performative. A dinner with Charlene in the 7th week that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. Careful and civil rather than warm. The specific, unglamorous work of 2 people and 1 extended family beginning to rebuild something on more honest ground than the ground it had been standing on before. Corinne Whitlow is 40 years old now, and her consulting practice has grown to 16 retained clients. She has hired a part-time associate to help manage the workload, a young woman named Destiny who reminds Corinne, she has said, of herself at that age, sharp and slightly too quiet about it. And she has become, in the Memphis small business community, exactly the kind of quietly indispensable financial strategist that gets recommended by word of mouth rather than advertising. Last spring, she took on her largest client to date, a regional food distribution company with revenue in the 8 figures. Work that would have been unimaginable to the version of herself sitting in a hospital bed 5 years earlier being told by well-meaning nurses to focus on adjusting rather than on anything ambitious. She told me that the thing she thinks about most from the entire period between the accident and the family meeting is not the meeting itself, and it is not the 8 weeks of readjustment that followed it. The thing she thinks about most is the Thursday afternoon at her kitchen table when her mother asked why she let people underestimate her. And she said something in that conversation that she has come back to many times since. She said, "I would rather he underestimate me quietly than resent me loudly." Because that sentence, she has told me, turned out to describe not just her relationship with Charlene, but the entire strategy that protected her. The quiet was never weakness. The quiet was the space in which she built everything that mattered, without anyone's permission, without anyone's belief, and without anyone's help. Xavier and Corinne are still married, and Corinne has told me plainly that this is not a story with a simple happy resolution stapled to the end of it. The marriage is different now than it was before the family meeting, more honest in some ways and more effortful in others. Xavier attends therapy now, individually and with Corinne together, working through what it means to have spent years measuring his wife against his mother's assumptions instead of his wife's actual life, and Corinne has told me there are still evenings when she watches him catch himself mid-sentence, about to speak to her the way he used to, more slowly, more carefully, before correcting himself, and she has decided that catching himself is, for now, enough. They went to marriage counseling together for the better part of a year, and their counselor told them something in one of their early sessions that Corinne has repeated back to Xavier more than once since, that a marriage does not actually break in the dramatic moment. It breaks in the thousand small moments nobody names at the time, and it does not heal in a single conversation either. It heals the same way it broke, in 1,000 small moments, chosen deliberately, one at a time. Charlene, for her part, has not fully reconciled what she learned that Sunday afternoon with the version of Corinne she had spent years building in her own mind. She is, according to Yolanda, quieter now at family gatherings than she used to be, less certain of her own conclusions. She has not apologized in the direct way Corinne once might have wanted, but she no longer says the things she used to say, which Corinne has told me is not the apology she once might have wanted, but is, at least, an honest and observable change. Here is what stays with me about Corinne Whitlow. Her mother-in-law spent 5 years building a story about a woman who could not contribute, who was a weight to be carried rather than a partner who was carrying just as much if not more. And that story was never built on malice exactly. It was built on the specific and common assumption that a body which functions differently must therefore be a mind or a will that has diminished along with it. An assumption that Charlene never once thought to test against actual evidence because the evidence, Corinne's quiet, consistent competence, was never loud enough to interrupt what Charlene had already decided to believe. What nobody in that living room understood until the folder went down on the coffee table was that the woman they had spent years discussing as a burden had been, the entire time, the single most financially capable and most carefully protected person in the family, and the distance between what they assumed and what was actually true closed only when Corinne decided the moment had finally arrived to close it herself, on her own terms, in her own time, exactly as she had built everything else in her life. So here is what I want to ask you before you go. The first question is about Corinne's choice to stay quiet for so long. She let her mother-in-law believe she contributed nothing for years rather than correct the record. Do you think that silence was the right protective choice given what she was dealing with? Or do you think staying quiet let the resentment grow longer and deeper than it needed to? And the second question is about Xavier. He never said the cruel things his mother said, but he also never once sat down and looked closely at his wife's actual financial life before accepting his mother's version of it. Do you think Xavier's passive absorption of his mother's narrative makes him meaningfully responsible for what happened? Or do you think the real responsibility sits entirely with Charlene? Drop your answers in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and this story is going to produce a comment conversation that runs for a very long time. If this story made you think about someone in your own life who has been underestimated because of something they were going through, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button if Corinne Whitlow reminded you of someone you know. And subscribe to Psyche Tales TV because we are telling the stories that matter on this channel, and this community is growing every single day, and we are grateful for every single one of you who is here with us. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one.